Well, for most part of the week, he has sat in a New York courtroom, a former president, listening to the claims about the relationships and the money prosecutors say are at the heart of the criminal case against him. Late today, Donald Trump's executive assistant took the stand. Here's Laura Jarrett.
Tonight, the prosecution closing out the first week of testimony by offering the jury a peek inside the inner workings of the Trump Organization from one of the people who knows the former president best. The state briefly calling Rona Graff, Mr. Trump's longtime executive assistant, to the stand this afternoon. Graff confirming contacts were saved on the company's computer system for Karen McDougal and Stormy, an apparent reference to Stormy Daniels. Prosecutors say both women were shopping stories of sex with Mr. Trump ahead of the 2016 election, encounters he denies.
Are you nervous about Stormy Daniels' testimony?
At the heart of the case, a $130,000 payment Michael Cohen made to Daniels so she wouldn't go public, and how prosecutors say that payment was disguised. But Graff shed no light on that, testifying even though she no longer works for the Trump Organization, the company is paying her legal bills. The jury also hearing from Gary Farrow, a former banker at First Republic Bank who helped facilitate the payment from Cohen to Daniels. But the day began with the defense team seeking to undercut the testimony of David Pecker, the former publisher of the National Enquirer and a key witness for prosecutors, testifying at length about how he helped silence people who could have hurt Mr. Trump's election chances. Mr. Trump's lawyer sought to raise questions about Pecker's memory and motives on cross-examination. Pecker defiant at one point, saying, "I've been truthful to the best of my recollection." The tabloid mogul also undermining the idea Mr. Trump wanted to bury those stories about women to protect his family, a common refrain from the defense. Instead, Pecker said he believed it was all to protect his campaign.
I do have to begin by wishing Melania happy birthday. She's in Florida.
Melania Trump notably absent at trial.
Laura, does it appear prosecutors got what they needed from David Pecker this week?
Lester, Pecker's a useful witness for prosecutors to the extent that he can test about conversations about Mr. Trump that touch on this alleged scheme to influence the election. But what he can't offer, Lester, is any evidence on the actual crime that the former president has been indicted for, which isn't a campaign finance violation. It's the way his payments to Cohen were documented on his internal records. Now, we'll see if other witnesses can speak more directly to that. Lester?
Okay, Laura Jarrett, thank you. President Biden was also in New York today giving a rare interview to radio host Howard Stern and making news about whether he'll debate Mr. Trump. Peter Alexander joins us. What did the president say, Peter?
Lester, for months, the president has refused to say whether he will agree to a face-off with former President Trump. But today he told Howard Stern, I'm, quote, happy to debate him, though he didn't say when or how many times. It would be a dramatic sequel to their two feisty debates 4 years ago. Outside court today, Mr. Trump, who, remember, did not participate in any of the Republican primary debates, said that he is willing to debate President Biden as soon as tonight. The Presidential Debate Commission has already scheduled 3 debates beginning in September, but neither campaign has formally committed. Lester?
All right, Peter, thank you. Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.